What I want to do is provide very quickly an overview of the nuclear industry in Ontario. We are a surprisingly large nuclear jurisdiction. And I want to talk about the role of the province in terms of emergency response to nuclear or any kind of a radiological event that occurs. So basically, we already heard that Bruce Power is the largest facility in the world. We are, in fact, one of the largest nuclear jurisdictions in the world. There's no other provincial entity that would have the number of reactors that we do. The vast majority of the nuclear work that occurs in Canada is in Ontario. There is a smaller reactor in Point Lepreau, New Brunswick. There's one that's been decommissioned in Quebec. Obviously, it's a very important component to our energy matrix, providing a lot of the energy that's utilized in the province. We have as well a lot of other nuclear establishments that are, for example, processing fuel or dealing with radiological materials throughout the province. A good example is the Cameco facility in Port Hope. So very quickly, I talked about the, us being a very large nuclear jurisdiction. Bruce Power, we've already heard about. What I will point out is that some of the major impacts that we look at with respect to Bruce Power would be agricultural, because it's a huge agricultural area. Populations are relatively low within that 10-kilometer detailed planning zone that I'll speak to a little bit later. Pickering, slightly different. 6 reactors operating here, 35 kilometers from downtown Toronto. You can guess that the major impact there is population. Within 10 kilometers, there is just shy of about 300,000 people. I think the most recent census is around 280,000. And going beyond that area, you can see is going into Mississauga, up to the bottom of Georgian Bay and so forth. So certainly some interesting planning challenges associated with that. A little bit farther away, we have the Darlington plant, 4 reactors working there. Again, a mix of population concerns and agricultural concerns. I'm just going to go ahead. Okay, Chalk River. This has been a site that's been established since late 1940s, I think. Been around for a long, long time. We're currently reassessing Chalk River because the National Research Reactor, which was located there, has been recently shut down. It's been defueled, is no longer operational. So we're assessing the balance of the site to determine the need for specific planning in that area. And on top of that, we have another situation with the Fermi 2 plant located in Michigan. They were really nice enough to put a nuclear power plant right on the border. So within 16 kilometers of that particular plant is the municipality of Amherstburg in southwestern Ontario. It is in that detailed planning zone, so we do planning specific to that facility. On top of that, there's the transborder, or the potential for transborder emergencies. So along the south coast of Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, there are a number of nuclear facilities in the US, some of which we're in kind of the 80-kilometer zone where there could potentially be impacts that would be dealt with through ingestion control. So we'd be concerned about food and water primarily, not so much a hazard to personal health from the actual radiation. And then certainly a number of other farther facilities that we keep an eye on as well. And to the point where even Fukushima happened, we were ramping up pretty full scale in terms of monitoring that. Obviously not so much in terms of radiation, but it was something that we needed to watch very closely. We have a plan for other radiological, and I should mention we have implementing plans for each of those facilities because, as I mentioned, they're all very different, unique challenges and so forth. So one overarching plan's not quite going to cut it there. We need very detailed, specific implementing plans. We do have another one for other radiological emergencies, and those are things that would include transportation accidents, because there is a lot of radiological material that moves along the highway system in Ontario. Obviously, terrorism enters into that in terms of radiological dispersion devices and so forth. And satellite reentry. And I always kind of chuckled initially when I got exposed to the nuclear file about satellite reentries, but you know what? That's a real thing. It happened in, I think it was '68 in the Northwest Territories. A Russian satellite came down and scattered radioactive material over an area the size of Prince Edward Island. So that is actually something to pay attention to. A big part of what we do in emergency management is the hazard analysis. So really understanding what that hazard is and resulting in what we need to do about it. Obviously, CANDU reactors are very, very safe, many inherent safety features. One of the most important in my mind would be the vacuum building. So if there is a core melt or radiation released, rather than going into the atmosphere, it's going into the vacuum building where it can be contained for up to 5 days in some cases. And during that time, the actual radiological materials, because of the characteristics of those, are essentially reducing or even disappearing where they have very short half-lives. We use natural uranium as fuel, and that's an important distinction from the facilities that you see down in the States. Fukushima as another example, where they're using the highly enriched uranium. So again, this hazard analysis is very important. We've just undertaken, and we're wrapping up fairly soon, a very detailed technical analysis being conducted by a company out of Atlanta, Georgia that specializes in this kind of work, so that we have a very current understanding of the technical basis for our planning. We're looking at extended meteorological data, so in some cases up to 5 years of weather data. Looking at local topographical features. What happens where there's a west wind over Bruce Power and it hits the escarpment? Where does that plume go? How does that impact the plume travel? Looking at impacts to drinking water and as well potential iodine doses. On the offsite, so it was already mentioned, but we deal with what happens outside the fence. So we don't have a plan for fixing a nuclear power plant. What our plan is to protect the public and the environment from ionizing radiation. That's our objective. The aim of the plan is to minimize any kind, well, to prevent any kind of deterministic effects. Those would be radiation burns and things of that sort, and to minimize any potential down the road stochastic effects. So those would be the cancers that may develop 20 or 30 years down the road. Off-site, or the on-site, of course, is the responsibility of the facility with the oversight of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So we have a plan. It's already been mentioned, the Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response Plan. We refer to it as the PNERP. One of the characteristics of that is that it's the only cabinet-approved emergency plan in the province. And the good news is that it's cabinet approved, which means it carries a significant amount of more weight than something that might be approved at a lower level. The bad news is we have to go to cabinet to get approval for this plan, and that's not an easy process. Just went through it last week, as a matter of fact. And it's a part of the overall emergency management all hazards framework. So we're dealing within our organization with all sorts of hazards, nuclear being one of them. We recently updated the master plan in 2017. We're currently working on the implementing plans very quickly. The new plan is aligned with international best standards, in particular GSR Part 7, which comes from the International Atomic Energy Agency. We've adopted new operational intervention levels from Health Canada. And we've probably one of the biggest changes is added a fourth zone, the contingency planning zone, which I'll speak to in a little bit. So what does a response look like? Again, the aim is to prevent deterministic effects, minimize stochastic effects. It's a very complicated structure. Normally I'd have an org chart up here, but in terms of responding to an event of this magnitude, there could be between 50 and 75 organizational stakeholders that are linked into us in the Provincial Emergency Operations Center. So putting that on an org chart up there is very confusing, and it's really small and you can't read it. But the way it works is this. The Provincial Emergency Operations Center, located up in Downsview here in Toronto, is responsible for directing all off-site actions and coordinating those off-site actions. So that really is the hub, and that's very different from another type of emergency. In this one, the province takes control immediately, whereas under a normal emergency, it's the municipality that deals with it, and then if they can't manage it, they come to the province. But there's a lot of support. We have a very strong linkage with the facilities, who provide personnel and expertise to the Provincial Emergency Operations Center. They also link in with the municipalities who implement directives coming from the Provincial Emergency Operations Center. So they would work with us in the PEOC, but they're also supported by the facility, and for example, decontamination and things of that sort. We have 12 provincial ministries that are all involved in the PEOC and running their own emergency management centers. Everything from traffic control to the health side of things to agricultural and commodity work and so forth. So they link in with the municipalities and with us as well. And then finally, we get federal support. So we have support from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, from Health Canada, NRCan, other organizations like that. So it's a very integrated kind of approach that we're dealing with multiple stakeholders. We've already talked about the notification process. Steve mentioned it in his presentation. I won't go into details of it. This, incidentally, is a picture of our Provincial Emergency Operations Center. It's the room we're very, very proud of, and we would prefer not to be in there if we could avoid it. But nonetheless, we spent a lot of time in that room. What I will say about this process is that it's world-class. There's a tremendous amount of international interest in how we do our notification and how those procedures fall out in the province of Ontario. So it works very effectively. Primary focus would be on protective actions to prevent exposure, to prevent ingestion of radionuclides. These are directed by the PEOC commander. There are default actions. If something happened at Bruce Power at 2 o'clock in the morning, we'd get that notification and we would immediately be able to implement protective actions at that time while we're ramping up our emergency response organization. Some of the precautionary measures that we'd be looking at doing would be closing beaches, recreational areas. Hospitals would have to change what they're doing in terms of non-critical patient admissions and so forth, so that they would have that capacity to deal with anything that might come their way. Exposure is very, very important. If you're not exposed to the radiation, then you don't have a problem, plain and simple. You can shelter in place for a limited period of time, which provides some protection. Probably not going to work too great in 40-degree temperatures in the middle of the summer, or when it's minus 30 outside and you're being asked to shut off your ventilation systems and so forth. But that's recognized that that only has its limited capabilities. Iodine thyroid blocking, I'm going to speak to that, and evacuation really, in our view, is the most effective way of protecting people. Ingestion control is very important, and you've heard about issues arising from Chernobyl. one of the things that happened there is that the accident was kept a secret for 7 days. So the kids in the area were eating carrots out of the garden, they were eating lettuce out of the garden, milk from the cow, all of that, ingesting these radionuclides. So this is a very important part of the response, is to make sure that people are not consuming or ingesting this product. Sheltering in place, I'm going to just go through this very quickly. I've already spoke to the fact that it has a limited capability, but nonetheless could be useful in a situation if we're in the middle of a snowstorm or something where an evacuation would be dangerous. We could utilize that. Evacuation, we're obviously moving people out of the way. The logistics are huge here. There's detailed traffic management plans, but you can anticipate Pickering and trying to move 300,000 people out of the detailed planning zone within 7 hours. The 401's not going to look pretty. It's going to kind of look like what I went through this morning to get here. And that's an interesting point, because you look at that and people say, well, you know, the highway's a mess, but look at all the people that it moves every morning, every afternoon. It's quite phenomenal. Yeah, so evacuation certainly probably the most effective way to do that. Okay, anybody heard of anti-radiation pills? Okay, here comes my rant. They are not anti-radiation pills, and if the media would please stop calling them that, because it's wrong. What potassium iodide does is it goes into your body, it is drawn into your thyroid, it prevents the absorption of iodine 131, which is radioactive, and is one of the radioiodines that would be emitted. All it does is protect your thyroid. If you happen to be exposed to cesium or one of the other radionuclides, it's not going to do anything. No help whatsoever. But it does protect that thyroid. So the use of the word anti-radiation pills really, really annoys me. And if you ever hear that from somebody, please correct them. Because it's very important to understand what it can do and what it cannot do. Ingestion control, I spoke to that in terms of the importance of it, the fact that they went for 7 days in Chernobyl without doing that, but we would be controlling the supply of water through the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food, would be testing pastures and livestock and all of those sorts of things. So that's one of the key ways to protect the public. The zone, incidentally, for this currently goes out about 50 kilometers from each of the sites in Ontario. Communications are a very important part of this, and is always a challenge in an emergency. I mean, quite frankly, governments have a challenge communicating very, very quickly, given approval processes and things like that. We've bypassed some of that because we have, in the Provincial Emergency Operations Center, 7 or 8 bulletins for each facility that we have. And those are already translated, they're already approved. I could authorize them within 30 seconds to be issued to the public. We've also, obviously, public alerting and so forth is very important. And you'd be aware of the Alert Ready program, where some of you have been annoyed when your phone has gone, and with the emergency alert. Some of you even further annoyed if you didn't get one, like me. But they are working that. I think our most recent test was an 80% success rate. Compared to, I think, about 50% with the first one. So we're going in the right direction with that. And that's it, and I think I did it in time. So anyway, thank you.